What happens when a nation believes its most fortified city is untouchable, only to discover in a single night that its defenses were built on an illusion? And how could such a strike ripple far beyond one airbase, reshaping NATO's strategic calculations and exposing Russia's deepest vulnerabilities? Before diving in, what do you think is the greatest weakness of any modern military: overconfidence, outdated doctrine, or misinformation within its own command? Shortly after 1:20 a.m. on November 25, 2025, Taganrog, one of Russia's most heavily defended aviation hubs, was jolted awake by the first alerts flashing across its vast command screens. Hundreds of Ukrainian drones mixed with advanced R-360 Neptune missiles were converging on the region in what would become the largest coordinated saturation strike of the entire war. Yet, inside the Russian command posts, officers showed little urgency. Taganrog, home to the Berev Aviation Complex and the development laboratories for experimental aircraft, had long been treated as a sanctuary. Generals believed the layered S-400 and Tor systems, combined with dense electronic warfare coverage, made it nearly impregnable. But complacency is deadly in modern war, and Ukraine had studied that complacency closely. According to defense analysts interviewed by Reuters and Defense News, Russian air defense doctrine relies heavily on identifying the highest value targets first. Ukraine exploited that very assumption by unleashing a massive distraction swarm of around 140 slow-moving drones. These cheap decoys did their job perfectly, flooding radar screens with clutter, forcing Panzer crews to burn through ammunition and causing operators to focus upward exactly where Ukraine wanted them to look. What Russian commanders did not see was the second deadlier layer hidden behind the noise. From the Odessa coastline, 4 Neptune D cruise missiles had already lifted into the night, each modified for land attack roles with GPS and terrain contour guidance. Flying at 30-50 feet above the Black Sea surface, they followed a sophisticated low-altitude profile similar to Western sea skimming tactics described in BBC analysis of Ukrainian long-range capabilities. The missile's 260-kilogram warheads gave them destructive force comparable to early American Tomahawk variants. Behind them, a third wave of fast bars jet-powered drones raced forward, using the radar shadow generated by the larger swarm. Western observers later compared this three-tiered strike package to NATO doctrine for overwhelming Russian air defenses, something US analysts had quietly modeled for years, even before Donald Trump returned to the presidency, and increased pressure on NATO to adapt to new asymmetric threats. Inside Taganrog, however, that strategic sophistication was invisible. Operators celebrated each downed decoy as a victory, unaware that real danger was streaking in just above the horizon. By the time thermal cameras picked up the incoming Neptune's, reaction time had collapsed from minutes to seconds. Only one missile was intercepted. The rest slipped through as if Russia's vaunted air shield were made of paper. What followed would mark a turning point in the conflict, one that neither Moscow nor its allies could hide. Because in less than 3 minutes, Ukraine's strike team would reach the heart of Taganrog's military ecosystem, where strategic bombers, next-generation AWACS prototypes, and Russia's only airborne laser laboratory were sitting exposed. But how much damage could a handful of missiles and drones truly do to one of Russia's most critical aviation centers? And what would this reveal about the future balance of power? How do 4 missiles launched from a dark coastline manage to slip past one of the most heavily guarded air defense zones in Russia? And why did nobody in Moscow realize the real strike wasn't coming from the sky, but from just above the waves? And for you watching, do you think modern warfare is now decided more by software and guidance algorithms than by raw firepower? While Taganrog's operators were distracted by the drone storm filling their radar screens, the real spearhead of the attack was already slicing across the Black Sea. At 1:20 a.m., the hydraulic legs of hidden Tatra mobile launchers locked into place along the Odessa shoreline. Moments later, 4 R-360 Neptune D missiles erupted into the night, their MS-400 turbofans screaming as they hugged the waves at Mach 0.85. Originally designed as ship killers, these missiles had been re-engineered for land targets, fitted with GPS guidance, advanced terrain contour matching, and hardened bunker buster warheads, capable of punching through reinforced structures. What made these missiles so lethal, according to Jane's Defense Weekly analysts, wasn't just their destructive payload, but their flight profile. At barely 10 meters above the water, they flew beneath the radar horizon, exploiting gaps in Russia's coastal surveillance network. This kind of low-altitude masking is a technique more often associated with NATO's precision strike doctrine, a fact not lost on Western officials, quietly observing how Ukraine's capabilities had evolved since 2023. But Ukraine didn't rely solely on the 4 Neptunes. Just seconds after launch, 15 jet-powered Bars drones ignited and surged forward from multiple frontline locations. These UAVs weren't decoys, they were hunters. Fast, agile, and designed to survive contested airspace, they tucked themselves invisibly into the radar clutter created by the 140 slow-moving drones drifting toward Taganrog. The maneuver resembled tactics used by US and British forces during saturation tests in the Persian Gulf: overwhelm, confuse, then penetrate. By the time the strike package stabilized at low altitude, they were racing toward Taganrog with a synchronized arrival time of roughly 43 to 48 minutes. Meanwhile, far to the south, Ukraine had launched an additional 94 drones toward Novorossiysk and Tuapse. Together with the Taganrog assault, this brought the total to 249 aerial assets, the largest coordinated drone and missile operation ever recorded in modern warfare. Western analysis later suggested this level of synchronization would normally require NATO-grade command and control precision. Some experts pointed to the influence of US ISR support, which increased after Donald Trump publicly pushed NATO to refocus on strategic denial operations during his renewed presidency. Russian coastal defenses, misled by the decoy swarm, misinterpreted the threat picture entirely. A DW reconstruction of radar logs revealed that operators assumed the southbound radar noise was spillover contamination from the Taganrog-bound swarm, not a separate high-speed strike element headed for the coast. This delay cost them their last chance at interception. By 2:03 a.m., after a 43-minute sea-skimming flight, the Neptune missiles rose just enough to crest the coastline. They were now less than a minute from Taganrog's most sensitive installations. Russian air defense crews, already saturated, failed to shift their targeting priorities. Operators kept firing at the slow, cheap drones overhead, believing they were stopping the main threat. They were wrong. The real attack, the one capable of altering Russia's strategic posture for an entire decade, was now crossing into the heart of Taganrog's military district at treetop height. What would happen once these missiles met the aircraft hidden in the hangars ahead? And how would Russia respond when its most precious strategic assets came under direct fire? What happens when a nation's most advanced air defense network, built over decades costing billions, collapses in less than 30 seconds? And for you watching, do you think Russia's defenses failed because they were outnumbered, or because Ukraine's strategy was simply more modern? At 2:03 a.m., the first Neptune missile rose over the coastline and entered Taganrog's airspace. Russian operators, overwhelmed by the ongoing drone chaos, were fighting a losing battle. The sky above the city glowed with the constant flicker of 30mm cannon fire missile trails and exploding decoys. Crews had spent nearly an hour firing at anything that looked slow, large, or suspicious, exactly as Ukraine intended. Many believed they were achieving spectacular success. Each drone shot down reinforced a dangerous illusion. In reality, Russia's integrated air defense system, S-400s, Tor M2s, and Pantsirs, had reached saturation. The network was collapsing under its own weight. Defense analysts told BBC News that Russia's mistake was doctrinal. Its systems were designed to stop a handful of high-value threats, not hundreds of asynchronous, differently paced strike elements. NATO planners have long warned that the S-400, despite its reputation, is vulnerable to multi-vector saturation. What happened in Taganrog was the first real-world proof. A Tor M2 operator spotted an incoming Neptune on thermal imaging at the last possible moment. He fired before the system had fully stabilized. One missile hit, creating a blazing fireball that momentarily lit the entire facility. But 3 surviving Neptunes and 15 fast Bars drones tore through the fractured defense line, flying at 30 meters above ground level. In those seconds, Russia's elite defensive shield meant to protect strategic bombers and next-generation prototypes was powerless. At 2:05 a.m., the first Neptune slammed into the main Beriev maintenance hangar. The 260-kilogram warhead detonated with such force that concrete walls were blown outward like thin plaster. Inside a 295 ms strategic bomber fuel tank's partially drained wings removed was instantly engulfed. The explosion ignited stored aviation fuel weapons components and specialized electronics. What had taken months to service and millions to maintain vanished in a single white-orange flash. But this wasn't the real catastrophe. The second and third Neptune missiles, guided by preloaded coordinates and refined terminal targeting, struck the most sensitive aircraft on Russian soil, the A-60 Airborne Laser Laboratory. This aircraft, an experimental platform carrying a megawatt-class laser designed to blind satellites, was a symbol of Russia's future warfare ambitions. It was also irreplaceable. Only two had ever been built, and this was the only operational one. Barr's drones followed the Neptunes like steel wolves, slamming into the fuselage and fuel systems, causing a chain reaction that melted decades of research into molten alloys within seconds. A New York Times military technology analyst later wrote that losing the A-60 was equivalent to the United States losing its only prototype for sixth-generation space denial warfare. The destruction didn't just erase an aircraft, it erased an entire doctrine. Shrapnel tore into the nearby A-100LL AWACS testbed, damaging its radar arrays and rendering it unusable. Russia had spent years trying to replace its aging A-50 fleet. That dream died on the runway at Taganrog. Experts from Al Jazeera and DW concluded that the strike effectively pushed back Russia's airborne early warning modernization by a decade, time Moscow no longer has in a war of attrition. Taganrog's airfield was burning, its runways cratered, its rarest aircraft destroyed. Yet Ukraine's strike package was not finished. What would happen when the flames spread beyond the hangars and reached the nearby UAV production lines, the very heart of Russia's drone warfare evolution? What does it mean for a country when the very factories building its future weapons are turned into firestorms overnight? And for you watching, do you believe destroying production capacity is more decisive than destroying equipment already on the battlefield? While Taganrog's runways glowed orange with burning bombers and the remains of the A-60 laser aircraft, Ukraine's second wave was already descending on the region's industrial backbone. The Molnia UAV production facility, only a few kilometers from the Beriev complex, had long been considered safe from deep strikes. Russian commanders believed distance-layered defenses and secrecy would protect their drone factories. That belief would be shattered in under a minute. At approximately 2:10 a.m., Barr's jet drones and FP-1 long-range drones plummeted toward the sprawling Molnia compound. Their guidance algorithms, refined through months of battlefield testing, were designed to automatically lock onto large metal structures, exactly the kind found in aircraft and drone assembly halls. The drones carried thermobaric warheads, each capable of creating pressure waves strong enough to collapse steel frames. Moments later, the sky above the factory erupted into a rolling chain of fire and concussive blasts. Inside precision, CNC machines, advanced electronics benches, composite manufacturing arms, and racks of half-assembled UAVs were annihilated. A lethal irony hung in the air. The very drones Russia depended on to counter Ukrainian attacks were being wiped out by Ukrainian drones at their birthplace. Defense economists told Reuters that Russia has already struggled to replenish high-tech drone components due to sanctions targeting microchips, optics, and flight control systems. Destroying the Molnia facility didn't just eliminate physical equipment, it severed a critical supply artery. Without sophisticated machining lines and calibration benches, replacing UAVs becomes exponentially harder. This is especially damaging in a conflict where drone attrition rates are measured by the hour. DW analysts later showed satellite images revealing a near-total collapse of factory roofs with heat signatures indicating secondary explosions, likely fuel cells, munitions, stocks, and lithium battery storage areas cooking off one after another. These cascading detonations magnified the destruction far beyond the drone's initial impact zones. Russia had invested heavily in UAV development since 2022, racing to match Ukraine's rapidly evolving drone ecosystem, backed by Western software and imagery intelligence. The Molnia complex was meant to be a cornerstone of this transformation, producing reconnaissance platforms, loitering munitions, and electronic warfare drones. Losing it meant losing years of industrial momentum, and the economic cost was immense. Analysts at The Guardian estimated the combined loss of machinery, prototypes, and infrastructure at hundreds of millions of dollars, before factoring in the strategic cost of production paralysis. The explosion also disabled key laboratories that worked on next-generation UAV navigation resistant to Western jamming. Without them, Russia is forced to fall back on outdated designs, widening the technological gap. NATO officials following the strike noted that this was not just a battlefield victory, it was a long-term industrial blow. Russia can repair buildings, but replacing the precision instruments and specialist teams requires time it doesn't have. With US President Donald Trump pressuring NATO to harden supply chains and expand ISR sharing with Ukraine, Western advisors quietly viewed the Molniya strike as a validation of deep precision warfare aimed at industrial capacity, not just fielded units. The fires at Molniya raged uncontrollably for hours, sending plumes of black smoke curling above Taganrog. But even as the factory collapsed into rubble, the southern arm of Ukraine's triple front strike was approaching its own decisive targets. What would happen when this wave struck Novorossiysk's oil terminals and Russia's Black Sea logistical lifeline, potentially igniting a crisis that even the Kremlin could not hide? What happens when a nation's supposedly untouchable Black Sea stronghold, one of its most vital arteries for fuel logistics and naval operations, is suddenly thrown into chaos? And for you watching, do you think crippling an enemy's energy infrastructure is more strategically devastating than destroying its weapons? While Taganrog burned in the north, Ukraine's southern strike package, 94 drones divided between Novorossiysk and Tuapse, was racing toward its targets. These drones were not distractions. They were the second hammer of a coordinated three-direction blow designed to overwhelm Russia's entire southern air defense matrix. According to timing reconstructed by BBC News analysts, the southern wave was the first to reach its objective, arriving just before 1:48 a.m. and catching local air defense crews completely unprepared. The S-400 battery, responsible for shielding Novorossiysk, one of Russia's most protected port complexes, had made the fatal mistake of focusing its sensors toward Taganrog. Operators believed the swarm noise on their screens was spillover from the northern attack, not realizing that a separate set of high-speed BARS drones was tearing toward them from a different vector. When the signature finally became clear, it was already too late. A BARS drone plunged directly into the S-400 launcher, detonating its fuel and triggering sympathetic explosions in the missiles stacked on the rails. Within seconds, Russia's pride, the billion-dollar air defense system marketed globally as invincible, was reduced to a burning crater. With the S-400 down, Novorossiysk, Russia's main oil export terminal and naval resupply hub, was exposed. Minutes later, FP-2 and Lutij drones dove toward the Sheskari's oil terminal, a facility that processes millions of tons of crude and diesel annually. Thermobaric charges struck storage tanks and loading arms. Fireballs erupted into the night sky, casting a hellish glow across the port. Supply pipelines feeding the Black Sea Fleet's fuel reserves ruptured, spilling burning oil like rivers across the docks. Defense News, analyzing satellite imagery the following morning, estimated that the immediate destruction put a temporary halt to nearly 20% of regional oil export capacity. NATO energy analysts called the event one of the most significant wartime strikes on Russian economic infrastructure since the invasion began. To the east, the Tuapse refinery, another crucial node in Russia's energy system, faced a similar fate. Drone impacts tore into distillation towers, pumping stations, and fuel reservoirs. The resulting explosions sent shockwaves through the facility. Flames quickly jumped service roads and ignited stacked storage pits. Fire suppression crews struggled to contain the blaze. Local communications channels leaked recordings of panicked operators reporting multiple uncontrolled fires. Then came the naval blow. A Project 1171 class landing ship docked in port, already low on readiness, was struck on its deck by an FP-2 drone. The impact ignited fuel stores and detonated munitions aboard the vessel, sending a plume of black smoke visible for kilometers. The once powerful Black Sea Fleet, already battered by months of Ukrainian strikes and forced to relocate much of its operations to safer ports, now saw one more ship crippled on its own dock. Western analysts immediately noted the larger strategic implications. With Donald Trump pressing NATO allies to strengthen maritime surveillance in the Black Sea, US and British ISR data helped confirm the scale of destruction. Reports from DW emphasize that these strikes did not merely damage infrastructure. They disrupted Russia's ability to project power southward, weakened its logistical pathways to occupied Crimea, and forced the Kremlin to divert air defense assets from the front line to protect deep rear facilities. Simultaneous fires across Novorossiysk and Tuapse illuminated the coastline like a war-era photograph. Russia's myth of a safe southern flank collapsed in real time. But if the southern attack broke Russia's defenses, the final blow would strike at something even more irreplaceable: its long-term military future. What would the loss of Russia's experimental aircraft labs, maintenance hubs, and next-generation radar prototypes mean for the Kremlin's nuclear deterrence? And could this setback be recovered at all? What does it mean for a nuclear superpower when its most advanced aircraft, its only airborne laser lab, and its next-generation radar platforms are erased in a single night? And here's a question for you. Do you think a nation's true strength lies in the weapons it already has or in the future systems it's still developing? By dawn, satellite images from US and NATO reconnaissance aircraft revealed the full scope of the devastation across Taganrog, Novorossiysk, and Tuapse. But the deepest wound was at Beriev, where the ruins of Russia's A-60 laser aircraft and the crippled A-100LL AWACS prototype lay scattered across melted runway slabs. These two platforms represented decades of research, billions in investment, and the backbone of Russia's future space denial and long-range detection strategies. Losing them was not just a tactical setback, it was a generational blow. Western experts quickly assessed the consequences. A New York Times defense analyst summarized it bluntly. Russia didn't just lose aircraft, it lost its next 10 years of aerospace evolution. The A-60, intended to blind or disable satellites, was Russia's only operational path toward competing with American and Chinese space control systems. Without it, Russia's capacity to threaten NATO's satellite network's communications missile warning targeting was severely reduced. The A-100LL, a critical step toward replacing Russia's aging A-50 AWACS fleet, was perhaps an even greater loss. This aircraft housed experimental sensor suites capable of tracking stealth aircraft and coordinating long-range strike missions. Defense News reported that the platform required imported microelectronics, now restricted by sanctions, making reconstruction functionally impossible under current wartime conditions. The Beriev aviation complex itself was gutted. According to DW and Reuters, the facility serviced Tu-95MS and Tu-142 bombers aircraft that form the air-launched component of Russia's nuclear deterrent. With the maintenance lines destroyed, Russia's strategic bomber fleet faces long-term degradation. Even intact aircraft will struggle to remain airworthy without routine servicing, specialized parts, or systems recalibration. In nuclear doctrine, reliability is everything. A bomber that cannot take off is no deterrent at all. Economically, the losses were staggering. Independent assessments suggested the total damage across all facilities, including aircraft factories, fuel terminals, and support infrastructure, exceeded billions of dollars. More importantly, much of this damage targeted irreplaceable systems, not simply equipment that could be manufactured again. And in a wartime economy where Russia is already struggling with sanctions, demographic strain, and an overstretched industrial base, rebuilding these assets may take decades. For NATO, the implications were profound. With Donald Trump pressuring the alliance to sharpen its deterrence posture, analysts noted that the Taganrog operation exposed deep structural weaknesses in Russian air defense doctrine. What was once marketed globally as an impregnable shield, the S-400 appeared vulnerable to coordinated multi-vector swarms. This realization is already shaping NATO exercises in 2025, with new emphasis on drone saturation decoy layering and low-altitude strike profiles. Ukraine's operation, while executed independently, mirrored key principles of Western hybrid warfare: overwhelm, deceive, and then strike at the industrial and technological nerves. The attack demonstrated that modern conflict no longer revolves solely around frontline engagements, but around the destruction of the economic, scientific, and infrastructural foundations that allow a nation to wage war at all. By the time the fires burned out, Russia had not only lost aircraft and factories. It had lost a decade of aviation progress, significant portions of its Black Sea logistics capability, and much of the credibility behind its deep defense doctrine. The psychological impact, as noted by European analysts, was perhaps even more severe if these deep rear bases were vulnerable. What wasn't? Yet even after this historic attack, questions linger. How will the Kremlin respond to losing such irreplaceable assets? Can Russia maintain its nuclear and aerospace readiness without the barrier of lifelines? And will Ukraine attempt another operation of this scale? Or was this a once-in-a-generation strike designed to force Moscow into strategic